Bucketeers. Good to see all of you here this morning. Welcome to the bucket courses. Everything you want to learn before you take the bucket. I'm Joanne Bungie. I chair the Community Education Council, the CEC, which is happy to sponsor these courses. If you will take a moment to silence your cell phone, and if you have hearing aids that accommodate T-coil, you can turn those on as well. Well, we have been waiting a year for Clark to come back and talk to us about criminal brains. And I remember last year when we said it would be this year, it seemed like a long, long way away. And here we are. We're so happy to have him back. He's going to be talking about criminal brains, and he is professor of biology, and Patricia A. Johnson, professor of neuroscience at Grinnell College. Welcome back, Clark.
Thank you. So can everyone hear me? Yes. Pretty good. So this is actually my third bucket course, which means that either, third time is the charm, I'll finally figure out how to do this, or 3 strikes and you're out. Let's see. All right. So the subject of this bucket course is criminal brains, and specifically the topic of criminals and what makes people criminals and what can we do about it. What's the best way of remediating the problem? No one will be surprised to know that humans have been very interested in this issue for a long, long time. Well over 100 years. The field of criminology goes back very extensively in history. And ultimately, for us to fully understand criminal behavior and how to remediate criminal behavior, it will require the cooperative efforts of many, many different professionals from a wide variety of disciplines, both academic as well as clinical. So psychologists, psychiatrists, biologists, neuroscientists, neurologists, even sociologists, political scientists. It's going to require a very extended effort from all of those different disciplines that will come together and hopefully help us better deal with this problem. I'm not going to try to do all of that, so even if I wanted to, I couldn't. But we're going to focus instead on the biological basis of what we've learned, particularly in the last 20 years, about some of the biological factors that go into causing people to be criminals. I will also touch on some of these other areas of study, particularly as they interact with the biological explanations I'm going to show you. And that's been one of the most exciting things that I've come across in reading about this subject. There's a very, very important interaction that occurs between some of these, for example, social factors and biological factors. So what I'm talking about is sometimes it has been referred to as nature versus nurture. So when I was in 7th grade, I wrote my first real paper. I probably plagiarized half of it, but I didn't know any better at the time. That was kind of copied out of the Encyclopedia Britannica. But I was very excited, and it was at a time when this was an emerging issue that people were talking about quite a bit, because this was when genetic engineering was coming of age, and people were starting to think about, these genes, are they determining human behavior, or what is the role of the environment, particularly the nurture part of it? If a kid was writing a paper today in 7th grade, they wouldn't write it on that topic, because we don't think about nature versus nurture anymore. That's not a way that biologists frame that question. It's nature and nurture. And particularly the topics that we'll be discussing in this course, we are referring to things like, when we talk about nature, we're of course again referring to genes, so the things you're born with, what genes you're given at birth, but then how those genes influences the development of your brain and the different functions of your brain, which then lead to behavior. So that's one aspect. In terms of nurture, there's the entire environment, which includes both the physical environment as well as the social environment. And those, of course, are both important for human behavior, but the two interact very, very closely with each other. If you think about it for a minute, if you have a particular gene that would perhaps cause your brain to be a certain way, it can't do that properly without having the right environmental influences that will cause it to be expressed in the proper way. an example I give to students is to show the fallacy of the movie Jurassic Park, which of course, I guess there's a new one coming out that's a take up on that. But the idea that you could possibly recreate a dinosaur if you just had access to the ancient genes or the ancient DNA. And the fallacy there is you couldn't do it unless you completely reconstructed the environment that the dinosaur was in. Because there's such a tight interaction between the genes and the environment that the creatures that would be produced would be something that's not a dinosaur, or certainly not the types of dinosaurs that existed a long time ago. So there's an interaction as these genes are being expressed and are producing the brain that are influenced by the social and other environmental factors. And then it also works the other way because, of course, humans with these genes that get certain kinds of brains, they influence their social environment and they also influence the physical environment. So the two are interacting, and you might say then that it's genes and the social environment that can then lead to criminal behavior. But I'm going to actually take it one step further and try to show you some examples where a better way of describing it would be not that genes and the social environment are influencing the behavior, but that they interact in very complex ways, and so that you get very profound, more than additive effects of a social environment and then a biological factor. And they interact in such a way that you get very, very powerful effects, particularly when those are lined up in certain ways. Okay, so that's the beginning. Let me start now. That was just the preface. So I want to start with telling you a story of Michael Loft. Okay. So Michael was an ordinary guy, 40 years old, no history of any criminal or mental health problems. No record of any problems at work, at home, among his friends. He had a master's degree. He was a school teacher in Charlottesville, Virginia, and he recently married a woman who had a young daughter. And from all accounts, he had a very good relationship. He was a model father. He had a very good relationship both with his wife and his 12-year-old daughter. Okay, all sort of ho-hum. Then everything changed fairly suddenly. He developed an interest in pornography. He began soliciting sex at local massage parlors, and you can probably see this coming, he made sexual advances to his prepubescent stepdaughter. Horrible. That only escalated, and at one point in time, his wife was working a late shift, and so it actually just became more and more inappropriate. He also became more short-tempered, and one occasion he actually pulled out some of his wife's hair during a fight, and this happened on Thanksgiving Day, 1999. Okay? So if you were on the jury, how would you vote? It's a pretty straightforward case. Is anything about, he committed a crime.
What was the specific charge?
Sexual abuse.
Uh-huh.
He's guilty, right? I mean, you have to do something about it. Is there anything unusual in the case that might be mitigating?
Sudden change.
The sudden change. I mean, presumably that's accurate, and so he was normal up to a certain point, and there was a sudden change. Well, here's what happened. So, he was found guilty of child molestation was actually what the charge was, and he was found guilty, and he was given the option of either prison or rehab, and that was because of this lack of any previous criminal background, which would be pretty normal. So you can, first time, have a chance to undergo a sexual rehabilitation program. He chose rehab. Smart guy. Problem was he got thrown out of rehab because he started coming on to the workers, asking for sexual favors. That doesn't go really well, and so they kicked him out. So the judge sent him to prison. Now, just the night before he was to enter prison, he went to the University of Virginia hospital complaining of really severe headaches. He was turned away. They thought he was just trying to get out of prison for at least a few days. So what did he do? Well, after he got turned away, he threatened to commit suicide, and then he just threw in, I'm going to rape my landlady too, for good measure, just to make sure he got their attention. And it worked. He was admitted to psychiatry, where once again, things would have been maybe okay for Michael, except just again behaved inappropriately to the female hospital staff. And so he was about to get even thrown out of psychiatry, sent off to prison, when something strange happened. He urinated on himself, which, that doesn't happen very often, but the unusual thing was that he urinated on himself and he didn't seem to care. I mean, most adults, if you pee in your pants, you feel embarrassed about it and you might try to hide it and whatever. In this case, he didn't seem to care. He was oblivious to the fact that he had just done that. And there was a very astute neurologist around by the name of Dr. Russell Swerdlow who became suspicious of Mr. Oft, and so he ordered a brain scan. And excellent. I couldn't. Oh, there it is. Sorry. We should have checked this out before. Okay. All right. So this was the paper where this result was published in Archives of Neurology, and here's what he found. Now, you probably don't look at brain scans on a regular basis, but I bet you can see something that looks a little bit weird in his brain, right? These are like a side view. The middle one is a coronal view, so it's looking like this. And then notice the top view, and you can see this mass. Actually, I have a pointer. You can see this mass right here. The guy had a huge tumor in his orbital frontal cortex, and it was impinging on his entire right prefrontal cortex. Okay? Might that be the explanation for his abnormal behavior?
Yes.
Yes. So before we answer that, I'm going to make you pause for a while. Yeah, these are a little bit hard to see, especially just the back.
Thank you.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to go back in time, about 160 years, back to September 13th, 1848, and the story of Phineas Gage. So how many, raise your hands if you've heard of Phineas? Okay, more of you should be raising your hands, because I talked about Phineas Gage. One of
I wasn't.
See, I told you there was going to be a quiz, you just didn't know. So Phineas Gage is a famous person in history for a couple of reasons. The main reason is because he suffered this horrific accident while he was working for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad in Vermont. And so he was on the crew that cleared the way for the railroad. And so they had to remove boulders, and sometimes these boulders would be large enough they couldn't physically move them, and so then they would blow them apart into smaller boulders so they could carry them off. And he was the head of the crew that was doing this job. And the way they would do it would be they would chisel out a hole in the boulder, then they would stuff gunpowder down in that hole, and then sand on top of that, and then the foreman, which in this case was Phineas Gage, would use a large tamping rod and tamp down the sand so that it would be really compressed. And so the idea is that when they lit the fuse and the gunpowder exploded, the force would go into the rock and not, back out the hole where you had chiseled it out. So that was the standard procedure. They'd done it many, many times, and on this fateful day, there was a distraction. Gage got distracted by some members of his crew that were fighting or doing something, and thought that his partner had put the sand on top of the gunpowder. So the gunpowder had been loaded in. He thought the sand had been put in, but it hadn't, and so he took his tamping rod and started tamping on the gunpowder, and probably caused a little bit of a spark when his metal hit the wood, and the thing exploded, and the tamping rod became a projectile. And it shot right through into his right cheek, came out about here. So he had a tamping rod, and you can actually see his tamping rod in his hand there in this picture. He lost his left eye, but other than that, the thing that was remarkable, there's actually two reasons this is a remarkable case. One is that he survived. In fact, He only lost consciousness for just a few seconds. He apparently was almost immediately able to start talking and even walking, and so he was able to help himself get to a local, not hospital, a local hotel where a doctor by the name of John Harlow came and did what he could to keep him alive, and sure enough, he survived. 3 weeks later, he walked out of the hotel room, apparently a fully able man. He had no motor deficits, he had normal intelligence, he had even the ability to, his memory was relatively intact and so forth. So he seemed like a normal guy, but he wasn't. And that's the other reason this was a significant event. Before the accident, he was extremely well controlled, well respected. He was, quote, a favorite with peers and elders. He was just a nice guy. He was the person who was put in charge of this because he was the one who could be depended on to lead this crew of ragamuffins on this job. After the accident, he was impulsive, irresponsible, vulgar, sexually promiscuous, a drunkard, and to quote one of his friends, Gage was no longer Gage. And so this, when I told you about this the first time, this was a significant event because this was when people first started thinking seriously about the role of the brain, not only in doing things like perceiving sensory information or producing motor control, but that the brain was also involved in more subtle functions like personality and developing a person's character. Is it possible that our brain could actually influence something like our behavior and turn somebody from a fairly well-respected person into somebody who we consider to be antisocial or even maybe somewhat pseudo-psychopathic? Now, unfortunately, so Gage never could keep a job. He ended up serving in various public forums. Here you see him, this would be like an example of where he would sit, and then people would come and pay money to look at this guy who was seen as a remarkable survivor, having that object thrust through the skull. Unfortunately, when he died, he didn't have an autopsy done, which would have been really nice, because it would have been great to have a post-mortem, and we could really, physicians could have really looked at his brain and figured out exactly where the damage had been. But we had the second best thing, because it turns out 5 years after his death, when John Harlow, the physician who had originally treated him, heard that he had died, Harlow wrote to the family and asked for his skull, if it could be exhumed, and they did. They gave him the skull and the tamping rod, which now is it's been on display now for a long time at Harvard in their anatomical museum, and so you can go and see Phineas Gage's skull and you can see his tamping rod. Well, about 10 years ago, a team of neurologists just down the road, at the time, this was Hannah and Antonio Damasio, who were at the time at the University of Iowa Medical School, and they got access to the skull, and using just careful measurements of the entrance and exit points from the skull, and then sophisticated brain imaging technologies, they reconstructed the pathway of the rod. And so here's from their science paper where they showed this result. And so they did know, there's going to be some variance, but they pretty much projected where the rod would have gone through his skull. And this is shown here. And this is probably more significantly. So here what they did is they projected what this would look like on a brain scan, not too different from the one we just saw from Michael Hoffman. Did you notice anything? It's roughly the same place. It's not exactly the same place. But to make it easier for you, here's the scan from Michael Offspring. And if you look at the scan on the right from Offspring, you can see that, especially in its, actually, I keep forgetting I have a pointer. Okay, if this is the level, roughly corresponds to this, and you can see that it's pretty much the same general proximity of where these two injuries had occurred. Now, in the case of Phineas Gage, it was not possible to do the perfect scientific experiment, which you'd want to do, and that would be figure out, fix his brain and then see if he returned back to this well-respected individual that he had been before the injury. That, of course, wasn't possible. But what about Michael Loft? He just has a brain tumor. And so, sure enough, after Dr. Swerdlow noticed the brain tumor, he sent him into the OR, where surgeons resected his tumor. seemed to be a normal person after he had his tumor removed. He had, from what we could tell, normal emotion, cognition, his sexual activity returned to normal. So then the judge said, okay, now go finish rehab, which he successfully completed. He didn't molest any of the rehab workers. He did a great job in rehab. And he was reunited 7 months later to his wife and daughter. No, you guys know. It can't be that simple, right? All right. Headaches and child pornography returned a few months later. This time, though, his wife, instead of calling the police, which she had done the first time, of course, she called Dr. Swerdlow, and he went back, rescanned his brain, and the tumor had grown back. So he resected it once again. I guess did a little better job because as of the time I looked at this, that he had been symptom-free for 6 years, so he hadn't had any of these tendencies for pornography and whatever. So it seemed like second time was the charm in this case, and he was cured. So what are the implications of this? First implication is that abnormal brains lead to abnormal behavior. We've seen it in two different cases now. Both Michael Oft and Phineas Gage, they had vastly abnormal brains, and that led them to commit abnormal behavior, in this case, criminal behavior. So, if we accept that abnormal brains, things like camping rods and brain tumors, can cause people to commit abnormal or criminal behavior, then why aren't we then also likely to see smaller, more subtle brain differences, structural, functional brain differences, also predisposing people to certain types of behavior, right? So that's one of the themes that we'll be looking at in this course. We're not going to look at any more people with brain tumors or tamping rods, but we will be looking at people who have brains that seem to be structurally and also functionally a little bit different from normal. And then trying to see if we can see a connection between their brains, their abnormal brains, and then their behavior, which we would call abnormal. Okay. So that's the first implication. The second one is, should people be held accountable for their damaged brains? Would you hold Michael Oft accountable for his behavior? Didn't he have any control? I mean, couldn't he possibly have resisted his urges and not molested his daughter, stepdaughter? Would you have been able to resist the urges if you had a brain tumor and it was causing you to have these extreme sexual urges? So those are all questions, right? We don't have a precise answer for that, but it raises some important questions about how culpable are we for our behaviors, particularly if it's possible to demonstrate that there is some functional or even some cases structural explanations for those behaviors in some way. And then lastly, given all of this, what should we do with criminals? Okay. Michael Oft's case, surgery was the answer. That seemed to have solved his criminal behavior problems. Maybe in some cases, drugs would be the appropriate treatment. And as we'll see later on in the course, we're going to look at some examples of problems with various neurotransmitter systems in the brain. And there's potential, it's still very early, but there's potential that some of those could be treated with pharmacological approaches, with drugs. Would that be the right approach to use for criminals if we can actually get to that point of being able to understand their behavior in that way? But let's even assume we can do that. So let's fast forward and say, through some combination of surgery and drugs, we can curb violent behavior, or we can actually fix people who commit violent behavior. What do we do with punishment? What about Michael Oft's stepdaughter? What about his wife? She was traumatized. She's going to live with psychological scars that will probably scar her for the rest of her life, not to mention his wife. What do we assuming we can fix Michael off, don't they deserve something? Don't they deserve some recognition that they're important people and they have a right to live free of fear and free of attack? And so one of the things I'm going to also bring out is this kind of interesting issue of punishment. And where does punishment fall, and what is its potential role in dealing with this problem? Okay, so are you ready? Go for it. I could take a break now, but I think I'll wait. Because we have another 10 minutes. Okay, so I'm just going to move on here. So what I want to now talk about is what I'm calling the evolution of crime. And since I'm a biologist, I have to put this into an evolutionary framework. Right? There's no other appropriate framework to just sort of describe anything if you're a biologist. And so what can we learn about the evolution of crime? So first what I need to do is review the theory of evolution by natural selection, which was an idea that was come up with roughly simultaneously by Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace in 1858. So they co-wrote a paper only after Darwin received a manuscript from Wallace that showed that he had been thinking along the same lines as Darwin. And so then Darwin got busy and actually they published together their theory of evolution by natural selection. And it's a really fairly simple idea. Okay, as described here eloquently by Darwin and others, it requires just 3 elements for natural selection to operate. There has to be variation. Okay, so there has to be differences. So in this room, we all have differences in our eye color, hair color, height, there's all these differences. So a population, in order for natural selection to work, there has to be some pre-existing variation on which to select. And so that's sort of the first key. Then there has to be consequences. So those variations have to make a difference in terms of what biologists refer to as the fitness of that individual. So those differences, those variations have to make one organism better fit than another in terms of gaining resources, which then of course allows them to live and live longer, but then also probably most importantly increases their chances of reproducing. Okay, which leads to the third requirement for evolution by natural selection, and that there has to be heredity. So there has to be transmission of these consequential traits which are varying. They have to be transmitted from parent to offspring. And it doesn't matter how that occurs. In fact, Darwin didn't understand that. Neither did Wallace. They didn't understand genes at that time. They just knew, everybody knew that traits were inherited from parents to offspring. And in fact, Darwin spent most of his, on the origin of species, talking about not natural selection, but unnatural selection, or the breeding of pigeons and other animals that was a pastime of his, and that had been really well understood. So it was known that offspring retain the characteristics of their parents. And so putting all of that together came up with this really very extremely powerful idea of evolution by natural selection. In fact, you could argue that this mechanism, this idea of natural selection, is so powerful that if you have these 3 elements, they will evolve. Okay, they will evolve by these principles. In other words, if you have, and whatever doesn't even have to be in the biological realm, if you have variation and there's consequences to that variation that ultimately alter the transmission of those characteristics into the next generation, it just will evolve. It'll just happen. Okay? You don't have to add anything more to the puzzle. Things will just evolve, and the organisms through generations will change, and they will change in ways that increase their fitness, increase the chance that they will be passed to the next generation. Okay? Is that enough of a primer on natural selection? All right. So I'm going to give you an example, but this is probably not the one you're expecting. These are not antennas on insects. These are actually, we talk about work that some NASA engineers did a while back. And what they were tasked with doing is creating little nano antennas. because the team they were working with at the Ames Research Lab in NASA was to create nanosatellites. And so these would be satellites that were much smaller than the conventional satellites. And the idea, great idea, if you can make these nanosatellites, it'll be much more, and then they can roughly do the same thing that the conventional size satellites can do. It'll be much cheaper, it won't take as much to get them into space, and the whole process will actually be significantly less expensive. So NASA was very interested in doing that. One of the features that you would have to have on a satellite, nano or otherwise, is you would have to have a really effective means of communicating information back to Earth. And so you need to have a really good antenna, but it has to be a nano antenna. Okay. So how do you design a nano antenna? And these guys decided to use an evolutionary computation method to do this. So instead of what you might think of a NASA engineer as sitting down and thinking about the properties it would have to have, this antenna would have to have, and then designing the features that would provide those different performance features. Instead, what they did is they created a program that would allow them to just randomly create a bunch of different antennas. And then these antennas could be tested for their efficacy in terms of whatever they were concerned about. So, for example, basically how far they broadcast, whether they had any kind of frequency dependencies that might be a problem or might be optimal, whether they could be focused and so forth. So all the kinds of things that engineers do when they're designing something like a nano antenna. But what they did is, instead of designing it like we normally think of a designer designing something, what they did is they just let it evolve. They just let the antennas take on a random shape, and then they selected from those antennas. And then the best ones, the winners, the ones that had the best performance characteristics, came to the next generation, and they took those and allowed them to change more. And then they selected the winners from that group and let them change subsequently. So you get the idea. They had heredity, they had generations of random changes. There was nothing that their computer was doing to cause the antennas to take on a particular shape. They were just evolving by random variations, and then they were being selected, progressively selected, and they ran this for like thousands of generations. What did they get? So they got a really good antenna, much, much better, but it had a really odd shape. Okay. So I don't know if you can see that. There's the two on the top, and just for showing you scale, they're next to a quarter. Okay, so these are little teeny tiny antennas, and by comparison, unfortunately there's not a scale bar on the bottom one, but by comparison, that was the antenna that they had built by the normal engineering techniques. And I think it's pretty easy to see that the antennas that they used by this evolutionary mechanism were certainly smaller, quite a bit smaller, and actually they outperformed the other antennas by a lot. And I kind of have the paper, I'm not an engineer, so I couldn't completely understand all of their terminology, but the impression I got is that this thing was way better than anything that they had ever designed in terms of the specifications. It was also really a cool advancement because it allowed them to fairly rapidly, if they needed to, like if, for example, if the conditions suddenly changed, like the mission changed, and so they were going to end up putting themselves into a different orbit, they could fairly quickly create another design by just altering the performance requirements. So they could start it up again, and then they could just basically now do slightly different performance to select. So they were selecting based on performance, and they ended up coming up with this antenna here. Okay? So what are the features of evolution by natural selection, or in this case, it's not exactly natural selection, it's unnatural selection. And just like Darwin pointed out in his book, the principles that he described for natural selection were the same ones that the Englishmen of his day had been using quite successfully for their unnatural selection of carrier pigeons and other animals that they had been selectively breeding. But it's the same idea. You have variation that comes about through random processes, and then selection for some characteristic, or some desired characteristic that you want those organisms to have. All right. I think I know this is a little bit early, but I think this next step will take like 10 minutes. Do you want me to keep going, or? Can you keep going for like 10 minutes? Sure. Yeah, okay. All right. So I'm on a roll. All right, so so what are the features of evolution by unnatural, or just basically the features of evolution by selection? So the first feature is that, that natural selection is a really powerful designer. Okay, it's extremely powerful. It was able to create a really powerful antenna that had characteristics that made it superior to the antennas that had been produced by other more conventional means. I wanted to give you an example of this because it kind of comes close to home. So Barry Sharpless, who is a chemist who received the Nobel Prize in 2001 for his work, and came to Grinnell the next year as our Danforth lecturer. See Luther back there remembers this. The reason he came, I understand, is his son was a student at Grinnell. Will, is that what it was? So we had a in on getting Barry Sharpless to come in and give a talk. And what he talked about was a technique that he had developed called click chemistry, and in which he was able to set up a system where chemicals would sort of randomly form more complex molecules. But they would be able to do that in somewhat of a random way. And the click chemistry was the chemistry that would allow them to form the chemical bonds that would form the final structure. So kind of like the antennas, he used a system that would, instead of thinking about creating chemicals that would do a particular thing, he just let the chemicals form themselves. But then he had a very powerful way of selecting from those chemicals to see which ones carried out the function that he was interested in. And the example he told us about when he was here in 2002 was the development of a chemical using this method that inhibited the enzyme acetylcholinesterase. Raise your hands if you've heard of that. Okay, some people have heard about it. It may seem kind of mundane, but in fact, the enzyme acetylcholinesterase is used to break down, to degrade a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And one of the places where that happens is between your nerves and your muscles. So whenever you want to move a muscle anywhere in your body, what happens is your nervous system sends signals out along the motor nerves. They reach the muscle and they release this neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And then the acetylcholine travels to the muscle and activates the muscle and causes it to ultimately contract. There's an enzyme there called acetylcholinesterase that breaks down acetylcholine. And it's absolutely essential because without that enzyme, you would never stop contracting, right? So if your nerve came down and told my finger to contract, there'd be nothing to tell my finger to stop contracting because it would release this chemical acetylcholine and it would just keep activating the muscle over and over and over again. Eventually it would diffuse away, but you get the idea. So this enzyme is present naturally at these synapses, and its job is to turn off the signal, which is extremely important for certain kinds of communication where it's not just the turning it on, but it's the turning off, which is critical. And in particular, one physiological function that is absolutely essential is the process of breathing. If you're an animal that uses air to extract oxygen, our respiratory muscles are just like regular muscles, and so they're told to contract by the same process that any other muscle is told to contract. And so what's going to happen if, for some reason, you're unable to relax a respiratory muscle? You suffocate, okay? To breathe, you have to contract your diaphragm and also some of your intercostal muscles to expand your lungs so air comes in. That's half of it, but they also have to relax back, and so pushing the air back out. And it's the regular inflation of your lungs and then deflation of their lungs that's obviously important for breathing because you have to keep getting a new supply of air to exchange with your blood so that you can actually acquire oxygen, get rid of waste products. So what's going to happen if you inhibit acetylcholinesterase in a person? Okay, they're going to stop breathing, they're going to die. And so so why would Barry Sharpless be wanting to create something like this? Well, part of it was proof of principle. He was trying to show that he could actually do this form of chemistry. But also there's some medical applications as well. So there are certain cases in the brain where acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter, and people, particularly with Alzheimer's disease, seem to have one of the problems for at least the symptoms, if not the cause, but the symptoms of the cognitive defects which I'm showing you right now, are lack of this neurotransmitter acetylcholine. And so one of the ideas is if you can inhibit its breakdown a little bit, then maybe you can boost their cognitive performance. And that has been used clinically. So that was how he couched his talk in terms of why they might be using this technique. But he also created a nerve gas. Okay? And unfortunately, we live in a world where people use nerve gases against populations. So you've heard of Sarin Gas, the Tokyo subway incident a while back. More recently, Syria. So the Syrian government was using sarin gas on its population. And so what sarin gas is it's one of these inhibitors of acetylcholinesterase. And the way it works as a terrorist tool is it basically kills a bunch of people all simultaneously because they inhale the gas and it prevents their respiratory muscles from working properly. The chemicals that Barry Sharpless developed in his lab using this evolutionary approach created chemicals that were 1,000,000 times more potent than sarin gas. The most potent, in fact, they are still the most potent chemicals that have ever been created. In fact, they are classified as a weapon of mass destruction. And he had to talk a little bit to me afterwards, after the talk, about some of the security requirements that he had to abide by in his laboratory to keep these from getting out into the general public, because they are very, very massively dangerous chemicals. So how does this relate to what we were just talking about? Again, another example of how using this fairly simple principle of natural selection or unnatural selection, you can create these really, really, really powerful designs that far outstrip anything that we've been able to do with our more straightforward approaches. So I think I will stop at that point. That actually does give me a breaking point. Great.
Thank you for taking your chairs. That's the fastest 10 minutes of the day right there. And now we're back to the second half of the first class with Clark Lindgren and Criminal Brains.
Actually, a question that was asked reminded me to, when Phineas Gage was hit with the tamping rod, it actually shot right through his head. It landed about 80 yards away, so it actually just blew right through it. And it, unlike the case of Michael Loft, where it was a tumor that was primarily just compressing brain tissue and making it dysfunction, that way when the tumor was removed, the brain was able to kind of rebound and take on its normal function.
What was the diameter of that rod?
1 1/4 inches. And it was like 3 feet 7 inches. Note to self, stay away from a hard hat would have helped because he was leaning over, so it came up this way. He shot it. So I don't know, there would have been no way to. All right, so where we were left is talking about features of evolution by natural or unnatural selection. Turns out it's not that much different. The difference between natural and unnatural selection is the way that you're actually choosing the winners and the losers. And so hopefully I've convinced you that it's a very powerful designer. It's capable of out-designing even some of our best intelligently designed objects. The other thing that this points out is that evolution by selection creates designs that are impossible to predict ahead of time. So, like if you look at, this is again looking at the nano antenna, are the lights low enough?
No.
There we go. There's no way you could have predicted exactly what this antenna would look like before you started, right? I mean, you know, they would have this little stretch and then it would bend at this angle and it would come up this way and do all of that. There was no way you could have predicted that ahead of time. It just happened. And so the same thing is true for evolution by natural selection. You can't predict exactly what's going to happen in the future, although we always try. So I'm teaching a class right now at the Newton Prison as part of Grinnell's Liberal Arts in Prison program. And as often happens in the beginning of a class on neuroscience, the students ask me, how are humans going to evolve? What's going to be the next stage of evolution? And I say,
If anybody tells you they know, they're lying, right? It's like Yogi Berra said, the problem with making predictions is that they haven't happened yet. Something like that, I might have misquoted that. You don't know what is going to happen. All you know, all you can predict ahead of time is that the end result will be more fit. It will actually have characteristics that are better than what came before because you're selecting on that basis. Okay. And then thirdly, the other thing that's very important to realize from this is that the final design, for example, of this antenna, depends on what came before. And this is really important in thinking about brain, the evolution of, for example, the human brain. Our brains weren't built from scratch. Okay? They weren't built from, putting together an optimal design of a brain and then starting without any limitations and just sort of creating a perfect brain. They came from species that preceded humans that had perfectly good brains themselves, and they were actually quite functional for the environment, for the ecosystem of those organisms. Human brains were modified from that, just like these different generations of antenna were modified from what came before. Okay? So you don't start from scratch, you always build on what came before. And one consequence of that you maybe have heard about, which gets slightly misquoted, misused, but the basic principle is accurate, and that our brain, our human brain, has, you can look at it as having both really old parts and then relatively new parts. So you've heard of the reptilian brain, perhaps. So there's a part of the brain that actually seems to be evolutionarily very old. It's shared by reptiles, for example. They have a really similar part of the brain, which we call sort of the midbrain area, that seems to be similar in humans and reptiles. The difference is sort of the added bends and curves that came with the evolution of the human brain, which then alters the whole function. And so the reason I say that gets misused a little bit is because, of course, the whole thing is evolving together, and so everything is changing, and so it's not quite the same as, it's not quite accurate to say we have a lizard brain and then we stick on top of that the extra features that make it into a human brain. It's all integrated. But the idea is correct. We'll actually look at some examples of where this older phylogenetically is the term that's used by evolutionary biologists to talk about the relationships between generations or between species in terms of their evolutionary history. But in looking at the brain function, we can see that, and we can actually see and can explain some of the otherwise paradoxical brain function in terms of that relationship, that there are certain things that happen and become amplified when some of those newer features are present. So for example, in the case of both Michael Loft and also Phineas Gage, the parts of their brain that were damaged is called the prefrontal cortex. And so it's the part right here in front of our forehead, behind our forehead. It's not in front of our forehead. Particularly the part right above our eyes and sort of right above our nose. That's actually very new territory. It's called Neocortex because it's, from looking at our other species, it's most well developed in humans by quite a bit compared to, for example, even some of our closest primates. So that's the new territory. One of the functions that new territory has is to regulate much more complex social behavior. Okay? And to control this more primitive, what's called the limbic system, which sits below it and is generating emotions, strong emotions of rage, fear, anger, and so forth. And so you can understand a little bit better if you sort of see that evolutionary relationship, why if you lose some of that function in your prefrontal cortex, you could lose some of your normal ability to control these behaviors, these very strong emotions and these strong predilections to do things. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's something we will come back to, and I'll try to show you some examples of that. All right, so let's go back to biology, but this is not going to be really, this is going to be this kind of biology. My background is in physics. I was actually a physics major, and so my students tell me I give biology lectures like a physicist would give. How do you approximate a human? You approximate a human as a 70-kilogram ball of homogeneous mass or something like that. That's a physicist's approximation of a human in certain kinds of problems. And I kind of have a tendency to do the same thing. I reduce things down to their most basic features because I understand it better when I think of it that way. So we're going to go back to biology. And so imagine that we have two creatures, two organisms, and they kind of look like human stick figures, but ignore that for the time being. These are just two organisms, and they're evolving.
like organisms will evolve. And so these well, there's more than two, but I'm just showing you two. These particular organisms have variability in terms of their different traits, different characteristics. They are going to be variable among the population. And those traits will make a difference, and those traits get passed on through some mechanism of heredity to the next generation. And for purposes of this diagram, we can think of these two organisms as they're competing with each other for resources and for mates. That's basically what biology, at some level, is all about. It's organisms figuring out clever ways to compete for resources and mates. Because organisms that do that win in the selection process. They get more of their traits into the next generation, and so those traits become more dominant. So what do you think, what would be the characteristics that you would come up with for these organisms? Knowing nothing about them, pretend you don't know that they have kind of creepy looking smiles and arms and so forth, but from what I just told you, what would you expect those organisms would have as characteristics?
Can walk and talk, mobility.
Not necessarily, I disagree. They wouldn't necessarily have. Oh, the question is they walk and talk. These ones probably do because they have legs, but let's just be more abstract about it. What personality characteristics would they have?
Cunning.
They would be cunning because that would allow them to be smarter than the other organisms and better able to acquire the resources or the mates.
Aggressive.
Aggressive, so it wouldn't be surprised at all to find them aggressive because that, as we know, is from watching Wild Kingdom, that's a good way to gain resources and gain mates, is to be aggressive.
Adaptive.
Adaptive to their particular circumstance. So they would be adaptive to their environment, they would be adaptive to their surrounding organisms, okay? So, for example, being big might be a good thing in their particular environment, and so being bigger would be something that would get selected. But maybe not. Maybe being smaller would actually be an advantage if they were in a place where being smaller was thought would hide better and use up less resources and so forth. Self-aware, maybe not. I don't know that would necessarily follow.
Healthier.
So somebody said sensitive. Sensitive to what?
Their environment.
Sensitive to their environment. Okay.
Reproduce?
And they would reproduce like crazy. Okay.
How about
So-
attraction?
Yeah.
Would they be
I didn't know.
attraction?
Attraction. So they would. Is that what you said?
Yeah, I did.
So they'd be attractive to the other mate. In
Yeah.
particular. Yeah. So I simplify this down, right? So here's what I came up with.
Yeah.
Because I like alliteration. So they would be strong. I don't mean that necessarily they'd be strong. I just mean they would be competitive. They would actually have characteristics that would make them better than the organism next to them. And that could be being bigger, that could be being smaller, that could be being more cunning, whatever word you want to put there. I just wanted to be S, so it fit. Okay. And they would be selfish, right? I mean,
Sure.
the more you can get, the better off you're going to be, and so you're going to be selfish. And they'd be sexy. They have to be really, really sexy. Yes, question?
The selfishness, is that not a characteristic of all living organisms? Except maybe an organism that has a maternal instinct to share with offspring until they go away, and then the selfishness comes back.
Okay, so hold on a little bit. So the question is, isn't selfish a property that all organisms have? Almost.
And sexy also.
And sexy.
I mean, these two are obviously attracted to.
I'm not telling you anything terribly profound here. This is really pretty obvious stuff, right? So I'm just basically, I'm working
They're
on.
attracted to other organisms that have longer left arms than right arms. That's a sexual characteristic.
It could be. Yeah, so having a longer left arm than right arm, if the mate thinks that's sexy and it prefers to mate with you, then that's an adaptive trait.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's kind of a weird logic to sexual selection, which is another sort of whole different object. But all that matters is that you're sexy,
Facial
and whatever's sexy is going to work. And actually, it doesn't even matter if it has any practical use, as long as the mates like it, then it's going to evolve, because offspring that have that same characteristic are also going to be sexy, and so they're going to actually reproduce more. All right, let's move on here. So crime be in this context? And I just put these down here. I gave up with alliteration here.
Yeah.
So sort of the standard crimes that we think of when we're talking certainly about human crimes, there's basically murder, assault. That's kind of the aggressiveness. So you kill somebody, that's considered a crime. You assault them, you physically assault them, sexually assault them, whatever. Or you steal stuff from them, that's a crime. And then there's also the whole list of sex crimes, which we talked about, pedophilia, for example. Okay? Do any of those make sense in this context that we just talked about? Would it be a crime to murder? No, actually, it would be, I lined those up so they're supposed to be kind of corresponding to the characteristics we just looked at. If murdering makes you strong and makes you better at acquiring resources and mates, then it's a great thing. Okay? There are, we taught a senior neuroscience seminar last semester, and we actually spent some time reading papers about the lives of gorillas, and they in fact regularly commit infanticide. It's a natural part of their repertoire. Well, how does that make sense? Why would they commit infanticide? It seems kind of counter to the whole idea. Well, they commit infanticide of the infants that were born to the other male that had been that had been the head of the harem before the other male took over. And so the first thing the male will do is they'll kill all the infants that are there because they're carrying the genes from the predecessor so that the new male can start from scratch. So would you say a gorilla is committing a crime by carrying on infanticide? Probably not. I mean, in terms of looking strictly at an evolutionary point of view, that behavior makes perfect sense. Similarly, stealing, and also, why would you limit your ability to have sex if that's going to increase the chances of passing your genes along? Okay? But now, imagine that you have another organism, and this organism is living in a group. And the group is such so that there's no intra-group competition. All of the competition is between the groups. So there's inter-group competition, but there's no competition within the group. Okay? So what would those individuals look like?
Cooperative.
They would be cooperative.
Hierarchical sometimes.
They might be hierarchical if that worked. That was one of the structures that allowed them to work in this group.
There'd be some ordering of their commonwealth.
I can't see who's talking. Oh,
There'd be
I'm
an
sorry.
ordering of their life.
There would be some ordering, and so, for example, some individuals might carry out certain functions, and other individuals might carry out other functions.
Self-control.
They might have some self-control because why?
Yeah, well, cooperative and not the negative reactions to their group negative consequences.
Or another way of stating that is that because their selection, survival depends on their group, not on them individually. So if their group succeeds, then they will succeed. And so their competition is now between groups. And does anyone know, so I think I put down some curiosity. I said altruistic. They would actually, in this type of group, be willing to sacrifice either themselves or at least some amount of their resources for the betterment of the group. They would be selfless, most likely, as opposed to selfish. There'd be no reason to be selfish. You wouldn't want to take something from a group member because that would actually limit the strength of the group. And I put loyal down. They would be loyal to the group, and that would actually include sexually loyal. And what am I, does this ring a bell? What am I describing here? What does this sound like?
Tribe.
Yeah, it sounds like insects, right? And so ants, bees, wasps, termites, they form these, sometimes they're called superorganisms. They form a hive or they form some collection where, and we all saw the movie Ant Story, right? We saw the ant having to be altruistic and completely selfless and loyal to the ant colony. Right, so certain social insects have really taken this strategy to the extreme. And to kind of give an idea as to how powerful this is, E.O. Wilson, who is actually an evolutionary biologist at Harvard, who has written a lot of this, points out that among the million or plus species of insects in the world today, and a million is, you know, a conservative estimate of how many different species there are, the social or the eusocial insects only amounts to about 2% of the species. Yet they completely dominate the insect world. So both in terms of numbers, both in terms of their biomass, and in terms of their impact on the environment. So these relatively few species of social insects have almost completely dominated the insect world. So if you're an insect, get the memo, form a group, because we're going to. Now, what E.O. Wilson also points out is that, you know, it's such a successful strategy, and you can sort of imagine why. I mean, if, you know, encountering a single ant wouldn't be that big of a deal, but encountering a million ants, that would be kind of frightening, right? Especially if they're all working together to kill you. So you can see how powerful these social groups are. Why don't they show up more often? And the reason they don't is because they're tricky. They really require very precise things to be in place. So going back to the antenna, they don't start from scratch. They require certain things to be there before these groups can form. And there's groups in various levels of developing this group structure. But to really develop this really tight, what we almost call like a superorganism, there's certain things that just have to be there. It's not that frequent. But when it does pop up, it's such a powerful strategy that it dominates the ecosystem. Okay. So let's think about our ants. Oh, I'm sorry, okay. So here's the problem. No, I'm sorry, I gotta get, okay. So where did the selfish, sexy, and strong go? That was one of the hallmarks of evolution by natural selection, right? Where is it? These individuals are just the opposite. It's a characteristic. Okay, so it's a characteristic of the group. So the groups are strong, selfish, and sexy. Okay, it might just be one queen bee that's having all the sex, but that's okay because she's having all the sex for the bee colony. Hi, thank you. Okay, so it's still there. So there's still the same selection that's occurring. It's just happening at a different level. It's happening at this level of the group. Okay. Now, one of the problems with this, okay, and so E.O. Wilson and others have proposed that this is not just restricted to the insects, but there's evidence of this same phenomenon occurring in mammals, where mammals have developed some of these characteristics of eusociality is what it's called. And so they actually, then the theory would be that they would potentially benefit, just like insects would, if this worked properly, to have these groups doing their competing for them. But here's the problem with that, and it's been a really, E.O. Wilson actually had tomatoes thrown at him on stage for some of the things that he said back in the day. He's been sort of redeemed now, and he's kind of gotten back into the mainstream, and people are seriously looking at his ideas. But one of the problems that people initially saw with this, with extending this idea of groups, and that being a profitable or a accurate way of thinking about a natural selection, is that it's got all kinds of problems. It's really easy to defeat the problem, and here's how it works. All right, you got a bad apple that shows up in your group. Right? So you have this really nice altruistic, selfless, loyal group members, and then you got somebody who now is competitive, selfish, and sexy. Okay. What's going to happen? It's going to break the group, right? Because that individual will have a huge advantage over all of the other members of the group. That individual gets the best of both worlds. That individual gets to live in a group, which takes care of many of his needs, his or her needs, like providing food and all these other things, fighting battles, whatever the group is doing. And then on top of that, this individual is using its own strength and savvy to basically take resources away from other members of the group. It doesn't take long to figure out that these groups will collapse really, really quickly if there's anybody that's not acting like the other group members are. All right? Okay, so it introduces a criminal, and I just put these three things back here. Now, it's starting, if you're in a group like this, crime, the way we normally traditionally think of it, is starting to make a little more sense, because now if somebody's murdering or assaulting in a group, one of these cooperative groups, or is committing theft or committing sex crimes, that's not helping the group. That's actually hurting the group. And so it's actually hurting the natural selection of those individuals that are members of the group. Okay. So what do we do? Or what do they do? What do you do if you've got a rogue? You banish him, okay? Send him away. Don't let him interact at all with your group, because then he can't do any harm, okay? What else? Kill him. Kill him? Hey, you guys are doing good. I'm following my mouth. Okay, so you execute them, because they're causing they're causing problems. They're going to pull your group down.
Rehabilitate,
Would they necessarily banish or execute? Could that bad apple become a leader in the group? He's the strongest.
Yeah, so the question is, could that bad apple, is there any other solutions besides banishment and execution? And the answer is, yeah, there's other possibilities like punishment. And so one of the ideas is that if you create a system of punishment so that the punishment is bad enough that it outweighs the benefits this individual is getting, then they presumably will stop doing it, right? I mean, if gaining resources, cheating, whatever they're doing, if you make the consequences really particularly bad by punishing them, of course, banishment would be really bad punishment, or execution. But there's a possibility then you can keep them in line if you actually have, if you punish them, or if there's threat of punishment. Okay? Sound familiar? Okay. So what would be some characteristics that individuals would have, additional characteristics that individuals would have in this group that we talked about earlier? So we said they would be altruistic, they would be selfless, they would be loyal. So let's add some characteristics to these group members, not the bad apples, but the good apples in this group. What other characteristics would they likely have? Besides cooperative. So they're cooperative, but what, because of this problem?
They're vulnerable.
Tolerant,
Compassion.
tolerant.
How about specialization?
So let me go back. I heard several. Tolerant. Why would they be tolerant? Because wouldn't that be just the opposite of what you'd want? Because you want to get rid of these guys, right? Because they're gonna bring you down. They're gonna pull your group down, and eventually you're gonna have a group just full of thugs, and you're not gonna have any altruists anymore. Because the thugs, their genes will take over because they're gonna be more selective. So why would you be tolerant? It seems like
You would hope change could occur.
so you gotta be more.
Self-preservation.
well, they're
Well,
resentful.
how about peer pressure? I mean,
So there
peer
would be, I like resentful, there would be resentment. What else? You guys are being way too.
Gotta be practical, nice.
Fear.
Maybe if they would develop fear, what would their characteristics be? What would, if you were in this group, think about it, you're in this group, and we don't really know it, but you have to have characteristics that are gonna sniff out a bad guy.
Well, you have
Anger.
Suspicious.
You gotta be suspicious. What else? Well, you have to have intelligence to be suspicious, right? But you're gonna be suspicious. What are you gonna do with that suspicion?
Judgmental.
You're gonna be judgmental. Makes perfect sense. You're gonna be judgmental because you are going to be looking for violators of your group's code, your group's nature. So you're gonna be judgmental. You're gonna be punitive, right? Because that's one of the mechanisms that would actually benefit your group, is if you were not only judgmental and suspicious, but then if you were the punitive type, if you were likely to punish individuals who were violating with your group's nature.
Extremely confident and powerful.
So extremely confident and powerful, maybe, although I would maintain that what you could also, that might be one possibility, but you could also use the power of groups. So if you have just one bad apple, you can gang up on that one, and even if that person's stronger than you're these group people, right? So you're these group organisms, and so you could do it as a group. But as a group, you would be strong and powerful. I put down vengeful. So you might be punitive, you might be vengeful, you certainly would be judgmental.
We aren't talking, what about discriminative or intelligent or fertile, or, I mean, what are some, like,
Yeah, so those are kind of, so those characteristics are going back to sort of the original idea. So if you had this group, yeah, you would be, you would have some of those characteristics. You wouldn't necessarily have to be fertile if, as long as the group as a whole was fertile. So again, going back to the,
well,
to the
somebody
bees,
has to be.
somebody has to be fertile, but it might not be you. I mean, so you might be loyal, you would be loyal to the group for the benefit of the one fertile member that is actually the one that's producing the progeny.
I don't know how to phrase this simply, but you would need to develop a structuring, a system of regulations in order to anticipate and respond to the outlier.
And so the idea is, would you have to develop a system for recognizing that? And you're kind of, you're already going where I'm heading, but you're already thinking about this in really complicated organisms, right? And so you can imagine this working at a fairly simple level, but yeah, once you start getting large groups and basically then you have to be a little bit more structured about how you do this.
For this individual is an aberration from the norm.
Yes.
But even in human society, there have been these aberrant characters who people say, they're not very nice, but look what they've got, and I'm going to go along with them. And that's where we get a Joseph Stalin or a Adolf Hitler and Idi Amin, Pol Pot. Couldn't they recruit people to wear brown shirts and take over?
Yeah, but I would maintain that even a Stalin or a Hitler, yeah, they were working for the group. And so are they antisocial? Was Hitler antisocial? I don't know. Not to the Germans.
No, they claim to be extremely social.
He was extremely social,
And,
right.
and if you're like me, we'll be a stronger group.
Yeah. So another way of thinking about this might help a little bit, is remember we talked about the criminal behavior, murder. Let's just look at murder, okay? So if somebody from the group on the right, doesn't matter who it is, murdered a member of their group, that would be a crime. From an evolutionary point of view, that would be counterproductive because they're not cooperating with a member of their group. That's sort of the ultimate non-cooperation, is killing them, or even just being aggressive in some way. But what if a person from group on the right came over to the group on the left and killed somebody? It'd be a hero, right? So that helps you understand sort of the moral paradox always bugged me, for a long time. It's like, why is it okay to kill somebody if you're in an army, and it's not okay to kill somebody if you're just walking down the street? Well, it comes back to the same idea, is that if you are acting in the interest of your group, then you're part of the group and you're loyal to the group. So the actual behavior itself, whether it's killing or being aggressive or being selfish, stealing something, or going and having sex, that isn't the problem. The problem is how it impacts your group. And so as long as it's helping your group, it's okay. Okay? If it's hurting your group, we call it a crime.
Well, what about the person who goes into a place that, like Miguel did in Syria, and then really wants to change things? Would that be a characteristic, even though there's some bad apples?
It would depend on who you talk to. For some people, she'd be a hero. For others, she'd be a criminal. It's all depending on which side you're on. Or, in this nomenclature, which group you're in. Okay? It's the other group, it's bad behavior. Same behavior that you do to the other group is good. So it really all depends. So I need to kind of move along. This is a huge discussion. We can keep talking about this, but let me kind of bring this a little bit to a conclusion, right? Because it's okay. All right. So what is the human condition? We've all been sort of talking around that. So this is what humans look like, and there's still debate about the degrees of these, but humans live in groups. Especially during our early evolutionary history, we lived in really tight groups, presumably. So we have this, you would expect humans would have these properties that we're associating with being in a group, because being in a group helps. If you're in a group, you can be more successful because you don't have to grow all of your food, you don't have to do all of your, you don't have to build the roads by yourself, you don't have to build the cars by yourself. You've got this group that you're in that's doing all these things for you, so you're cooperative. So there are certain elements of this groupishness that fully characterizes the human condition. And humans are probably the most social of the mammals. Not to the degree that ants are, but we're pretty darn social. But we also have this other, more primitive property of competing with one another, right? We also still, even in our groups, you know, come on, we still cheat. Don't look at me like that, like I'm the only one who we break the rules. You ever hit somebody and then regret it later, whatever. Okay, so we're scoundrels to some degree. But we're not really scoundrels, we're just operating on the same principle that has been true forever, and that is that if you're stronger, if you're selfish, and if you're sexy, you're going to do better, and your genes are going to get pushed along. So humans are stuck in no man's land. We're sort of stuck, a poetic way of saying it is we're midway between heaven and hell, okay? We have two natures. We have a nature that is, through evolutionary processes, has made us selfish, has made us sexy, some of us, and has made us strong and competitive. And then we also have this other nature that's been working as well in evolving features of, I think I have these listed here. So the characteristics that humans have based on this are, aren't we an altruistic bunch? We love it, right? All of our movies are about how altruistic we are. We brings a tear to our face hearing of somebody sacrificing for another member of our species, and loyalty, that's box office gold if you've got those three things going there. But that would be enough, right? That would be kind of boring after a while, because we also have, we're also selfish, we're deceitful, and we're cheesy. So there's Hollywood for you. Hollywood makes billions of dollars because those are always competing with each other. We're living at these two different levels of selection. And that might vary a lot in different parts of the world. It certainly has probably varied significantly during history. So some of the anthropologists and others who tried to reconstruct early human history, which of course is a really challenging thing to do, since you can't actually go back and look at it. But it looks like some of these properties of groups were even more powerful back in sort of our early struggles to develop as a species, and where these group behaviors were really, really critical and came to the fore. Finally, we as a species, as individuals, we are judgmental, we are punitive, and we are vengeful. Get over it. We are. Can't not be that way, because those characteristics would have evolved in a species like ours that was taking advantage of these two different levels of selection. And so we would need to be vigilant, we would need to be judgmental, we would need to be, if it's appropriate, punitive, and so forth. Okay?
I'm sorry to be the class windbag. I promise this will be my last question.
You're lying right now.
That's an important trait, and that's one that will go down through evolution, and it trumps altruism, because when you act in an altruistic manner, it makes you feel good. You're walking down the street and you see someone that's overparked, you'll put a quarter in their meter. Or you do something, a random act of kindness. It's not because you're altruistic, it's because it makes you feel good.
Yeah, so I went through a lot of stuff really fast, but one of the points I did make, which is a really critical one, and so thank you for bringing this up. When we're talking about evolutionary traits, biologists talk about proximate versus distal, or mechanistic versus teleological explanations. And so when we're talking about traits evolving, we're not saying that the organism has figured it out and going, oh, I'm going to be altruistic because that's good for my group. All that has to happen is that the organism will behave altruistically for whatever reason is motivating them to behave. And maybe it's a good feeling. So organisms where individuals got a good feeling when they helped others, those organisms will evolve, and they will be very successful because they will form groups that are very cooperative and get these warm and fuzzy feelings when they help each other. So that's the difference between proximate and distal. All these things, again, these things are all happening, and we're looking at them after they've happened. And the mechanisms to get there doesn't really matter, as long as all we can predict ahead of time is the features that will show up after evolution has had a chance to select. Okay, does that help a little?
A little.
All right, so I'll stop, and what we'll do Next week is we will go and look at genetics and look at what has been learned, particularly in the last 20 years, certainly since I wrote my paper back in the 7th grade, about genes and how they influence brains and how those then influence behaviors, particularly criminal behaviors, and so that will be the topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Our-
Clark.
The bad news is that this is the end of our first class, and the good news is that we have 3 more classes to go. So if you will turn on your cell phones and turn off your decoil, we'll plan to see you all back here again next week for our second class. Thanks for coming this morning.